Oh, we're going to talk a little bit today about Greek theater. Greek theater is an obvious and important place to start when you're talking about the history of theater, particularly about the history of Western theater. Um, I would go so far as to say that basically all theater and movies and television and the things that you watch on a daily basis have really important relationships and descend from ancient Greek theater of like 2,500, 2,600, 2,400 years ago. It's really important. It's really critical. We're dealing with it every day. The sitcoms we watch are descended from the Greeks. Tragedies and dramas that we watch are descended from the Greeks. It truly is historically significant. But it's also important not to overstate it. Sometimes we get too focused on what white male historians have told us about the past, and there are other theatrical traditions other than the Greek tradition and the Western tradition. Theater has roots in Africa, theater has roots in China and Japan and Korea and every area of Asia. Theater had roots in Native American cultures in the U.S. before any white people even came there. Um, so theater comes from a lot of places, comes from a lot of rituals, comes from a lot of sources. Um, and it's very important to remember that while we're talking about all the important reasons that Greek theater is really the most important progenitor of the kind of theater we actually do today in this country. So we're going to talk a little bit about it really quickly. Please review all the materials because I'm not going to talk about every single thing. I love talking about this stuff, and it could go on forever, but I'm going to try to be as brief as I possibly can. Um, the Golden Age of Greece, in terms of both theater and a lot of other things, is about 2,600 years ago. You may have in history classes encountered the notion that Athens is the birthplace of democracy. You may have heard about the philosophers Plato and Aristotle and Socrates. Um, you may have heard of the Pythagorean theory in your math class. Basically, how geometry came about comes from the ancient Greeks. You may have heard about the Hippocratic Oath that doctors take. Uh, First, do no harm. Um, uh, that comes from ancient Greece and that society. A whole lot of important arts and architecture and philosophy and politics comes to us from ancient Greece through the Romans, through Europe, um, eventually to America. Um, and a lot of the kind of theater that we do in America comes from the Greeks to the Romans, skips over the medieval period, but in the Renaissance is revived and is embraced by people like Shakespeare and comes down to us in the kind of things we see on TV and movies today. Um, Greek theater was religious in nature. It was done at religious ceremonies, big festivals that celebrated the season, the harvest, the planting of crops, and that honored their particular gods that they worshipped at the time. People came from all over Greece to Athens or to whatever large area that the plays were being performed at to see these days long performances of plays that were both religion and plays and also competitions to see who could write and perform the best play and win a prize. Um, we believe that theater comes from dithyrambs, which were long hymns honoring the gods, danced by choruses of a whole bunch of men. Um, Eventually, these things get written down. They're not really theater as we think of them in the dithyrambic form, but eventually, someone begins to speak lines, begins to add characters to it. A lot of times, the credit for this goes to a dude named Thespis. Um, he is frequently credited as being the first actor, as stepping out from the chorus, the big group of people who sang and performed these religious ceremonies, and presenting dialogue and delivering lines directly to the audience as a character. It is really hard to know if Thespis really did exactly what that is. People didn't write down these historical things in exactly the same way we would. Um, but we do give Thespis a lot of credit because if you've heard the phrase thespian, that comes from Thespis. Actors are thespians because Thespis is considered to be the first actor. Once again, we can know about Thespis and know that someone had to do these things without being sure that it was exactly Thespis who did all of it, or it wasn't some sort of transformation done by a bunch of people. Um, Greek theater was religious. Of course, religion was very different for the Greeks than it is for us today. But when they had their big festivals, people stopped doing what they're doing. Wars took a break. Everything was ignored, and thousands of people came to the ceremonies and the plays. Um, there was a big festival called the City Dionysia, and to honor the god Dionysus, the god of wine, fertility, and revelry. Uh, the fact that they had a god of wine, fertility, and revelry may indicate some of the differences between their religious practices and some of the religious practices of today. It was in the spring, and in 534 BC, the tragedy was included. Um, and then eventually they had comedy and satyr plays as well, the three primary genres of Greek plays. Um, the Olympic Games come from this same era, and for kind of the same reason, to celebrate, to honor the gods. Um, and those were athletic competitions, not plays, but it's kind of the same spirit. Um, the City Dionysia was a religious and a civic event and a festival and a fair and everything else all rolled into one. And it had these plays that were performed over the course of days in competition. The physical theater that the Greeks did this in were amphitheaters. Um, they were built into hillsides so that they didn't have to build them up like you see a football or stadium today, where you basically create a hillside by building a big concrete structure that has at the bottom a playing area. The Greek theaters also had a playing area at the bottom, but they built them in the hillside for the seating so that the playing area was at the bottom of a natural area of the hill. Um, there's an article included about the acoustics of these places that's kind of interesting in your materials on uh, uh, in this module. Um, the acting area was surrounded on three sides by the theater, like a modern day thrust theater that we'll talk about later. And of course, they did these only outdoors during the day. The only illumination they had was the sun. There was no artificial lighting, so they would take place starting early in the morning and go till there was no more sun to do plays in front of. A few of the words that they used for their theaters are still important to us today. Theatron meant viewing place. Of course, we still use the word theater. The orchestra was the playing area where they actually did the performers were. Today, we call the ground floor of a traditional theater where the audience sits the orchestra, and we also use that word for a group of people playing music. The scena was the building behind the orchestra where they dressed and where they had their props stored, and the backdrop against which they did the shows. We have co-opted that word skene for our word scene, scene, and they used what we would call flats or scenery. They had something called periactoi, which I still use today. I've built a periactoi recently, a three-sided thing that spin around and gives three different scenic views of a thing that you can put behind people. They had what was called a machine or a machine. It was a crane to drop in a god during the plays. They had all sorts of interesting scenic devices. Uh, we'll talk a little bit more about. Well, let's say first, the Greek theater was masked. Um, that's one of the most important things to know. Uh, Big, huge masks that covered most of the theater, of the face of the performers. It makes for a very different way of thinking about how theater functions. We don't have any of these masks, but from our understanding, they were made of like wood or stiffened leather or linen. They were large and gave, of course, the performer one expression that you would have seen, not a variety of expressions like contemporary actors can provide. Um, and they force the actor to face the audience in a way that has really profoundly affected theater today. Um, but they also mean that the acting must have been quite specific and formal, not realistic, not emotional in the way we would think of it, but really relying on the voice and the larger body to convey any kind of information that could actually be conveyed. Um, Check out the pictures of Greek masks. We don't really have any actual ones, but masks are one of the most important aspects of the Greek theater. I'm going to cut here and move on to part two to finish this brief lecture about ancient Greek theater.